So you say I was 53 years old. I was paralyzed and completely dependent on others for everything forever. I had no job and no viable prospects for getting one. My life consisted of lying in bed all day and watching TV. And then you say this sentence. You say, well, physically incapable of anything, I still had my mind.
That's I think that's the difference between being on a ship that floats and being on one that sinks. Because when you assess all of the things that you can draw upon, your mind being the most important.
The fire inside. The fire inside.
Welcome to The Fire Inside. This is a podcast where we tell real stories of how we persevere, overcome, and rise from extraordinary circumstances. Each conversation here is powered by the vulnerability and resilience of remarkable survivors who are also advocates and change makers. They're people who found ways to keep going even when the path forward wasn't always clear. I'm your host, Sarada. In today's episode, I sit down with Joseph Groh, whose world shifted forever in 2008 after a devastating biking accident left him paralyzed from the neck down. And what continues to move me about Joe's story isn't just what happened. It's what he chose to do next. Just 1 year later, he founded the Joseph S. Groh Foundation, which is a nonprofit that provides relief and meaningful support to families living with life-altering disabilities. And that's the part I keep coming back to. Because how do you go from absorbing the reality that your body may never function the same way again, to turning outward and becoming a resource for others? When do you grieve? When do you process what you've lost? And how do you find the strength to build something that serves people walking a similar road? In this conversation, we talk about all of that. About resilience in real time, and about purpose that's forged in pain, and about what it truly means to turn unimaginable loss into lasting impact. Let's get into Joe's story. I am so excited to talk to you. I randomly ran across your website on like a random Google search, your nonprofit, the Joseph Groh Foundation, and I was blown away by the work that you guys do there. And but then when I researched it more and saw how it was born through your own story, I was in absolute awe. And so I'm really excited to dig into that with you today so that you can tell us how you got from where you started to where you are now. Can you take me back to, was it 17 years ago, roughly? This point?
It was, as hard as that is to believe.
It was 17 years ago. So that day of June 15, 2008, can you tell me about that day?
Well, that day was Father's Day, and one of our children was able to come home and celebrate with us. We have 3 children, and he had spent the day with us. The weekend, really. And it was about 5 o'clock or so. And Sue was taking him back to the airport. And I decided to go on a quick aerobic ride while Sue took my son Stephen to the airport. So I did that. We live by Lake Grapevine in Texas. And there are some nice trails that encircle the lake. So I thought, well, I'll ride on one of those. And as I mentioned, it was an aerobic ride, so I was booking a little bit. And I came around a turn on the trail, and there was some sand on the sidewalk. And that caused my mountain bike tire to slide toward the opposite edge of the sidewalk. And when it hit the edge, the bike stopped suddenly and threw me over the handlebars and broke my neck and damaged my spinal cord at C4, which is roughly at the base of your neck.
So when you went over the handlebars in that moment and you're on the ground, what are you thinking in that moment?
Well, actually, I was unconscious for a little bit. And when I came to, picture in your mind's eye, sitting on a mountain bike and how you're positioned, where your arms are, where your legs are. And then imagine staying in that position, but now laying on your back. So when I came to, that's how I felt. That's where I felt my arms and legs were. And it felt a little strange, but then I turned and looked down on my left side and saw my left arm and hand on the sidewalk. And that's when I knew something was seriously wrong, because my arm wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be up in the air.
Yeah. So when you saw your arm there and it wasn't where it was supposed to be, what did you feel after that? Did you start panicking?
No, I knew at that point that something serious was wrong. And so what I tried to do at that point, my voice was not as strong as it normally was. And of course that was because of the paralysis. I didn't know that then, but so I slowly started trying to call out for help. And it was roughly about 6 o'clock. And it was, again, Father's Day. And so I was a bit concerned that no one would find me. You know, that hour, that's dinner hour. And so I did have that concern. There were some people in the bay that I could see, but that they couldn't hear me. And so I kept calling out rather rhythmically, you know, for help. And the one thing, I remember starting to panic a little bit, but, you know, I told myself, you know, you cannot do that. You'll hyperventilate. And so, you know, I focused intently on, you know, just speaking rhythmically, breathing regularly, and not panicking.
Okay.
It sounds strange now, you know, talking about it in a conversation, but being that I knew something serious was wrong, and that life was going to change, you know, I told myself that, you know, no matter what happened, I could, you know, never give up, that I needed to, you know, never look back, and I needed to stay positive. And, you know, I've tried for the past 17 years to, you know, to adhere to that. And that's a little bit become some of the slogan of the foundation.
Right.
But it was born in that moment.
The moment that you're lying on the ground.
Yes.
That was the first moment. It's interesting you say that it sounds, you know, crazy now when you're talking about it. I think it sounds powerful. And where do you think that came from? Just that, like, innately inside of you. Where do you think that the wisdom to be able to say, stay positive, remain calm, where do you think that came from?
I remember a Methodist minister that we know gave a sermon once about overcoming difficult situations. And he said, you know, overcoming difficulties is a function of three things. Number one, it's a function of your faith, of course. It's a function of your upbringing, and it's a function of your support network. And, you know, I have always had a great support network. I have a wonderful wife. We've been, you know, married for 43 years now. You know, growing up, I mentioned this in the book, from 2 wheels to 4 that, grew up in the Midwest. There you go.
I have it right here. I have it right here, and definitely have notes and highlights.
But, growing up in the Midwest, grew up in a big family, nine kids in the family. Part of that came from, the upbringing, just needing to not be passive, because life was going to be very different. And so you needed to be aware and you needed to deal with it.
I love that. To hear you say that and understand that it comes from a place of foundation, is really comforting, because it's like, that's the one thing you always know you can go back to. It's rooted in you. So let's go back to that moment. And so you're looking for someone to hear you. Who ended up finding you?
A gentleman was walking the trail, and he had his probably 6-7-year-old daughter with him. And he heard my pleas, and he found me. I was just off the trail, and his daughter had some great Gatorade that he gave me, because that was the first 100-degree day of the year. And so by that point, it had been about an hour since my accident, and I was pretty thirsty. And to this day, grape Gatorade or whatever still takes me back to that moment, and it's a good memory.
It's a good memory. Okay, great.
But anyway, so, he found me, and we talked a little bit, and he didn't have a cell phone with him, but there was a road not too far away. So he flagged down a motorist who did have a cell phone, and they called the, Grapevine 911, and they dispatched an ambulance. And what's funny about that, we were only about a mile from the firehouse where they dispatched the ambulance from, and I could hear the siren coming. It's a very strange feeling to be lying on the ground, hearing a siren, and knowing it's coming for you. It's just kind of a surreal feeling.
Surreal. At that point, outside of knowing something serious had happened, had you ever considered that you were paralyzed?
I didn't. They took me by ambulance to Parkland in Dallas. And it was only when we got to Parkland, and there were 2 doctors that they had like a stylus, and they were poking different parts of my body, asking me if I could feel that. And they did the first round, and I had said, no, I can't feel that, to any of their questions. And then they did a second round, and same result. And I'll never forget, the 2 doctors turned and looked at each other with a look of serious sadness on their face. And that's when I knew that, yeah, you're paralyzed.
You're in the hospital room. You know that it's serious. Even though they never told you specifically, you had figured that you were paralyzed. What's going through your mind in terms of what your life is looking like from here on out?
Well, there was just a lot of open field, had no idea. Didn't have any idea what was coming in the next 3 hours, much less the next 20 years. And so, we took things day by day. It wasn't really until I got out of rehab, which was about 7 months later, that I started to deal with, okay, now what comes next?
Okay. So when you were in there and you're getting all the information you need, but then you're processing it in your quiet moments, you said you never really panicked. Did you ever feel hopeless?
I would say, I would feel incredibly sad, about what was lost. And the things in life that we would no longer be able to do, that you would just kind of, you figure, okay, someday you'll retire, you'll travel in your retirement. Obviously, none of that was going to happen.
Did you have hope of regaining movement? And did you ever lose that hope?
I decided early on as a strategy to assume that I would not regain much of anything. That way, if I didn't, I wouldn't be terribly disappointed.
I want to read this, something from your book that you wrote. Since the accident, I have gone back to the well of imagination many times, including when I can't go to sleep at night, during certain medical procedures, and other times when I am powerless to control my environment. What was happening in your imagination?
Well, one example that comes to mind from what you were just mentioning was when I was in either the CT or MRI, I'm not sure, but the machine makes a very loud staccato sound. And, you're in this machine for, I don't know, an hour, and, it could drive you nuts. And so I imagined that I was on a Navy ship, and, those were the guns going off of this ship. And so you imagine yourself being on this Navy ship doing what you need to be doing, and then you're in the flow of the sound rather than have it be objectionable. Things like that.
Okay. Let's go to your imagination to make the current moment a little bit more tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You also wrote something in your book that I found to be very profound. You said, overcoming adversity is a destination for some and a journey for others. Which path did you choose initially, and how did you choose that?
It's a journey because, being paralyzed this high up, it's funny, people think that the paralysis is the thing that you really have to deal with. And it is, but because of the paralysis, there are so many side effects. And that's why it's a journey, because it's not just one thing. It's something every single day. And I began to think, because I was only 53 at that time. And I thought, you have a long time to live here. So, what are you going to do? How are you going to make life fulfilling and not be a total pain to everybody around you?
From the moment you left the hospital to after New Year, between that time, I think you also mentioned in the book that you were back and forth to the hospital for various things.
Yes, in fact, I was released in about August from the hospital. And between August and December, oh gosh, we were back and forth to the hospital, any number of times. And in fact, around Thanksgiving, I had developed sepsis. And, that's obviously a very serious diagnosis. And I remember at one point the doctor had said that, I was on the strongest antibiotic that they had. And if that didn't work, there was nothing they could do. And so, again, a strange feeling to look up at the IV drip, knowing that your life hangs in the balance of whether or not that's going to work.
You're finding ways mentally to move forward and build anew, with this new transition in life. But then still dealing with what's sort of, like you said, the side effects of what's happening. How did that struggle feel, and what did you do to cope with that?
Well, number one, I've always been fortunate in that I've had a pretty positive, outlook on life. You need to give something back to that support network. Mm-hmm. And what I try and give back is, a positive outlook, trying not to be too whiny, about things, and trying to engage in life. Don't engage in your disability. Don't engage in some of the things that are maybe dragging you down, but try and live in a way that you're not focused on all those things.
On that note, you talk about a solutions mindset in the book as well, that if you focus on a problem, then it becomes a bigger problem.
Right.
But if you focus on the solution, you realize the problem isn't really that big of a problem.
And I had always, that was one of the strengths I always felt I had in the business world. When you first see a problem that looks very difficult, it's a little bit like, how do you eat an elephant?
Yeah.
One bite at a time. And that's how you solve problems.
Yeah.
You don't try and tackle them en masse. You start to break them down and understand all of the different elements of them, and then you start to prioritize. And again, that's being, solutions oriented.
Absolutely.
And,
I'm going to read from your book one more time, because this section right here, it jarred me to a point where I had to take a break for a moment, because it was such a positive thing to say. So you say, I was 53 years old. I was paralyzed and completely dependent on others for everything forever. I had no job and no viable prospects for getting one. My life consisted of lying in bed all day and watching TV. And then you say a few more things, and then you say this sentence. You say, while physically incapable of anything, I still had my mind. And I feel like this is exactly what you were saying here when you said, at least to me, that's what it meant. And that's why it felt so powerful, felt like you looked in your tool bag to see what you still had. And you say, I still have my mind. And then, as we're very well aware, used your mind to build another kingdom, So what did that moment feel like for you when you realized, okay, you've processed the loss and, you've been reminded of what you don't have, but then you go, oh, wait, but I do have this.
That's I think that's the difference between being on a ship that floats and being on one that sinks. Because when you assess all of the things that you can draw upon, your mind being the most important.
How'd you go from I'm lying in bed watching TV every day, but I have my mind, to I want to do something to help others?
First of all, I had this contractor set a great example, the one that had worked with Sue to get the house, fixed up. That's what gave me a vision of what I could do. Second of all, I had always assumed in my mind that when I retired, one of the things that I would do would be some sort of philanthropy, whatever it might be. I was blessed to be in a good family. I was blessed to have a great career. And so I thought, giving back was something that, I owed society. But then once you are in a situation where, for example, you could start concentrating on, like you mentioned, all of the things that are wrong. But it's, to me, and kind of what I found is, it's when you look away from yourself, you look at others, you really see where, no matter what you're going through, there's always someone worse off than yourself. Always. And it's not, no matter what your situation is, it's not hard to look out and see that.
Absolutely. Fulfilling, especially knowing that though you may have more limitations than before, you have a purpose, a sense that you always knew you had and wanted to do, and you can still fulfill that.
And, the journey that we started on 17 years ago, I could only imagine and, set goals for where we're at now. wondered if we would ever get that far, especially in the beginning. But again, you just take it one step at a time. You have that solutions mindset.
Yeah.
You keep focusing on, what's the next step you can take.
So tell me about the Joseph Groh Foundation. When did it start? What's unique about it?
Our vision was for several reasons, but our vision was to help people who have worked in any of the construction trades, and who are now, for whatever reason, doesn't have to be work related, are living with permanent and truly life-altering disabilities. So, not the kind of thing where, you tear a nerve and, you're going to be down for 3-4 months. But, people that are paralyzed or people that, for example, we've had a number of situations where parents who are in the trades have a son or a daughter who was born with serious issues, and they're going to have to be their caregiver forever. And so, now this child is 11, 12 years old. They can no longer pick them up and lift them into a car. So they need a wheelchair van. Those are the kinds of things that, we thought we could help people with. So the first step was, that vision. The next step was finding, people that could help us formulate that vision into a written plan. And then the next step after that was to file for 501c3 status.
Okay.
And we did that in July of 2009. And then we began to think about, fundraisers, and also how we advanced awareness of our foundation, so that once we had raised some money, we had, a grant to give.
Yeah.
And that took about a year.
Oh, wow. So how many do you have? I think you told me a stat, right, of how many families or individuals you've been able to provide assistance for?
Right. So far, as of now, and we really say families because, in my case, for example, when something like this happens to you, the impact is felt. It impacts everybody in your family, because, and I wrote about this a little bit in the book, your family has to, they need to make the adjustment themselves.
Yeah.
To your, whatever your situation is. And so it truly is a family affair. So anyway, to date, we've been able to help 146 families in 38 states.
That's amazing.
And our grants, as of right now, have totaled about 1.4 million.
Wow.
So it's not a huge number, but it's like my old boss, who's been a great supporter of the foundation, as he has said, you're not changing the world, but you're changing for that individual, you're changing their world.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a huge number, especially based on what you just said. Like, helping one person is already a feat in itself, let alone being able to help as many people as you already have. And the mission is growing and continuing, which is amazing. So tell me about the book. What inspired you to write the book in the first place? And then I think you have a second one that's coming out or has come out. Okay. Tell me about that.
It has come out, yes. I like writing, number one. I've always fancied myself as being a halfway decent writer. And so, the idea of writing this book, helping, if it, help people with their thought processes about, whatever difficulties they were going through. That was one objective. Another was to bring awareness to the foundation. So that was a second objective. And then also having the voice-operated computer made it possible to write a book. So, and it was self-published through Amazon at that time. And writing the book itself was fun. Editing the book was awful.
Why?
And it's painful because now it's like writing the book is you're dealing with your creative side.
Okay.
Editing the book, you're dealing with your critical thinking side.
What's a truth that you hope that people will take from your story when they're faced with something that feels impossible?
Probably the biggest truth is to look outward. Don't look within, but look outward. Realize that, and look around and see physical examples of people who are worse off than you. And then knowing that, put your own situation in perspective and then approach, resolution in a solution-oriented mindset.
If you could sit with yourself, with the version of yourself from before the accident, what would you tell him about what's coming and who he becomes?
That's an interesting question. I think in a small way, I addressed part of your question in that first book. I talk about when we were watching the Oscar award ceremony. I think it was in the 90s sometime. And Christopher Reeve was on stage. This was after his injury. And he was addressing...
I remember that, by the way. I was watching it too.
Right. And that was how many people saw him and said to themselves, I would rather die than be in his situation. And, Sue and I kind of talked about that, and we both thought, that's terrible. I'd rather have died than go through what he's doing. And I'm not quite going through what he's doing. His injury was slightly higher than mine, but about probably 3/4 of an inch represents the difference between his situation and mine. But nevertheless, going through a version enough of it that, it gives you a lot of perspective anyway.
So what would you say to yourself?
After you get over the shock of hearing, about the future, I would tell, my former self, that there is life beyond that immediate accident, that immediate moment, and that it's a very good life. It's a very rewarding life. Not to be caught up in the moment, and don't be caught up in yourself and your own situation. But again, to realize that there are others worse off, and to look outside yourself for answers as to how you can help overcome, what's liable to be some of the worst moments you'll ever have.
Wow. And that's why you call it a journey, because that's a lot that you've learned over 17 years to be able to tell yourself, wow. But that's also powerful advice across the board, I think, for anybody that hears your story, to remember everything you just said. Because regardless of what the struggle is, putting one foot in front of the other, it's like you really do need that mindset to give yourself the highest quality life especially for you, and then also for the time that we have with everyone around us. So you've answered this question. You definitely have, but I have to ask it. It's the $1 million question. Where does your fire inside come from?
I think it came from my upbringing, from my parents, from the attitude about life that they kind of imbued within me. It came from the experiences that we had growing up. We were always taught to be self-reliant. As young as 6th grade, I had, for example, in the morning a paper route. And this was in the Midwest where cold and snow and all that stuff. But you got up and, if your mom had to wake you, you were both irritated.
Yeah.
And so, you learn to set your alarm and get up, and you had to fold all the papers. And, nowadays they just throw it in the street in front of your house.
Yeah.
In those days, you had to walk up and put it inside the screen door. Otherwise, your customers would call and complain.
Wow.
There was, and I also had, after school, we worked with the head janitor, and we would sweep out the classrooms and do all that kind of thing. So, I had 2 jobs in grade school. And so, those kinds of things taught you the value of hard work, and, being responsible for yourself. And I think that helped build the fire that, I drew upon when this terrible situation came along.
Absolutely.
Because it wasn't like you had to reach back that far into your past for that fire, because I believe I've been feeding that fire all throughout time, from, the first jobs that I held, and how, if you weren't being satisfied with that work, I had a blessing and a curse whereby sometimes you would be in a job, and after 3 or 4 years, you just found yourself getting bored. And I saw other people around me that same situation, they were bored, but they're making decent money, and they decided to just kind of settle. They could, life could be pretty easy. You didn't have to work hard. I couldn't do that. And I've always been a driven kind of a person. And I think, that's part of that whole fire inside kind of.
It is. Anyone who listens to your story in any medium, whether it's through the book, through the foundation, through podcasts, or anything else that you're doing, is widely inspired and incredibly grateful that you are sharing your story, especially with so much honesty and vulnerability, because it really does help even those of us who aren't in your exact situation be able to look at your story, your perseverance, and your overall determination and drive, and not only be grateful for the fire inside of you, right, and where it came from, but also be grateful that we can take something from that to help us move forward as well. We're really grateful for that. So for everyone that is listening, can you tell them how they can support you and your foundation?
You can go to the Joseph Groh, Groh, Joseph Groh Foundation.org. Or if you simply Google my name, Joseph Groh, it'll come up. You'll find it.
So I learned so much from you today, from your book, from everything. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time to sit with me, go deep. And I'm incredibly inspired by your journey. So thank you for breathing life into us today.
We very much appreciate the opportunity to get to know you, to talk with you, and to also share our story, because we love to do that.
What stays with me the most about Joseph Groh is how grounded his strength is. When his life changed in an instant, he chose to focus on what he still had, his mind. And that perspective, which was shaped by his family and strengthened by his community, became the foundation for everything that followed. Support matters. It's huge. But mindset is what carries you minute by minute. And Joe reminds us that even when your body changes, your capacity to imagine, to care, to build something meaningful, that's still available to you. There is life beyond your hardest moment, and it can be full. It can be impactful. It can be good. But it begins with what you believe is still possible. Until next time.
The fire inside.
If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to hold on to, please take a moment to like this episode wherever you're listening and share it with someone who might need it. You can stay connected with us on Instagram at the Fire Inside Podcast for behind-the-scenes moments, upcoming guests, and continued conversations about what it takes to persevere, overcome, and rise. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Fire Inside. I'm your host, Sarada, and I want to take a moment to recognize the team that brings these stories to life. This podcast is produced by Andrea Denise Johnson, Stacy Young, and myself. It's edited by Brad Phelan and Kenrick Polly Rob Mejia. Mixed and mastered by Martin Stebbing. With set design by The Pink Hammer. Original music by Mark Batson. And production services from Local Astronauts. Truly a dream team. And together, we want to remind you that when you're faced with a challenge, you can quiet the noise and listen to the fire inside of you.